there's this huge machine working to undo America. Antifa is one part. You have big money, you have organized nonprofits, you have student groups, all of it working towards the goal of revolution.
All right, welcome back to Fill in the Blanks. Today, we have an extraordinary guest, Andy Ngo. Now, Andy is a New York Times best-selling author of Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. He is also an independent journalist and photographer who fearlessly delves into the world of American Antifa and the militant far left. Now, his reporting and expertise have put him in the crosshairs, and he lives under constant threat. Some of these threats have come true for him. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that's not all. Andy's impact extends far beyond the written world. He has testified before the United States Congress, lending his insights to critical discussions. Now, you've probably seen him on countless television shows, heard his voice on radio programs, and even caught him on various podcasts. His journalism has graced the pages of prestigious publications like the Wall Street Journal, New York Post, Newsweek, Fox News, National Review, and now as the editor-at-large at the Post-Millennial. Andy continues to shine a light on the hidden corners of our society. I call it the tyranny of the fringe. So I want you to join us as we do a really deep dive into the stories that matter, challenge the status quo, and explore the uncharted territories of truth. So welcome, Andy. I really appreciate you getting back with me. We were on my stage not too long ago, so I'm glad to talk to you again.
Thank you. I'm honored to be on and to have this privilege to speak with you, Dr. Phil.
You've got a lot going on. You always do, and I'm really tickled to death that you have written Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. And I would like to start talking about that to begin with, because I don't want to run out of any kind of time. Tell me about this book and why you wrote it, what your inspiration was, and let's just start talking about that.
Dr. Phil, you wrote a book recently about the tyranny of the fringe, and there are many fringes, political extremes that exist domestically in the United States. Unfortunately, some of these movements organize into violent extremism, and my book, Unmasked, focused on one particular movement that has wreaked a lot of violence and misery and injuries on the American public. That movement, it calls itself Antifa. They claim to be anti-fascist, but that label is a misnomer. Their tactics use violence and intimidations, killings if need be, property destruction, vandalism, with the goal of silencing their opponents by any means necessary. Now, they claim that their opponents are fascists, but they go after journalists, they go after regular conservatives, they go after women who speak up about women's rights. Anybody who they politically disagree with is labeled a fascist and is therefore subject to be targets of violence and injury and worse.
So who are these people?
It's a movement of people who organize under an ideology of anarchism and communism. One of the tactics that they use is called black bloc, and that's where they dress head to toe in black, cover their faces with black masks, and gather for ostensibly a public demonstration that almost always devolves into either brawling with people that they want to fight and to injure, and setting buildings on fire, attacking police stations, injuring police officers. In 2020, after George Floyd died, that was their propaganda moment to really embed themselves into larger protest movements in the United States. And they were able to agitate for riots that happened in Minneapolis, in Portland, in Seattle, and so on from coast to coast. The people who are involved are typically young people. Looking at Portland, Oregon, where I'm from and where I did my reporting at the time, that there were about 1,000 people who were arrested over months and months of nightly riots, really violent riots, might I add. And the demographic that I can pull out based on the arrest data is these are young adults, typically in age from 18 to mid-30s. There's a split representation of male and female. Most of them are white. They claim to be protesting for Black Lives Matter. Often the businesses that they target are businesses owned by Black families and immigrant families. So their whole movement is based around deception, from the name to what they say they fight for. And I think part of the reason in the success that they've had on a propaganda level in the mainstream media and legacy media, because if you look at the legacy media reporting, either through broadcast television or newspapers, these people are described as racial justice protesters or anti-racist protesters or even social justice protesters. And that really is giving into the deception that is part of their propaganda. So my book seeks to unmask their activities, their ideologies, their origins, and how dangerous they actually are. And in addition to my writings, I was on the ground for many, many years in Portland, Oregon, which is really the epicenter of their organizing. And I went out, recorded with just my mobile phone or GoPro, because I wanted the public to see for their own eyes what the videos and photos capture. You know, it's one thing if you don't believe my interpretation of events, right. That's fine. You don't have to follow my writings, but watch the videos.
And what are the consistent things you've caught on video? Obviously, these people get violent. Do they actually spawn the confrontations, and how do they do that?
So where they are most effective is if they can embed themselves into a larger movement, because the number of people who are willing to engage in violent confrontations and violent criminalities and starting fires is relatively small. But you only need a small number of people to actually be quite devastating and damaging, or to even lead a revolution, which is their ultimate goal, by the way. They would like to topple the United States. So going back 4 years, during the protests that erupted across the United States after George Floyd's death, there were a lot of decent people who showed up because they really thought that they were protesting against police brutality, against racism in police departments, et cetera, et cetera. And within this sentiment of police hatred or police dislike, these agitators came in and did things like, for example, breaking a window on a building or starting a fire on the street. I've talked to law enforcement sources, and they say that those type of actions act as, it shifts the dynamic in the crowd. When it's at night and fires start, it's much easier for that protest group to devolve into a riot. And breaking a window then creates it's like blood in the water when you also have criminals and other bad faith actors showing up to these protests who are hoping to loot. And that's what we saw happen over and over in cities. A business would get broken into, dozens of people would swarm in and loot it, and then the next business, police are overwhelmed, police are demoralized, police are defunded. So it's the danger of Antifa is that they create an environment where political violence is normalized under causes that sound quite noble. And so the violence happens in front of us, in front of the American public, and people don't recognize it because misreporting in the media, journalists like myself who are out there with videos and photos are beaten and robbed. In 2019, in downtown Portland, I was severely beaten by a group of masked Antifa members, all in black. They surrounded me, they robbed me and my equipment, they punched me repeatedly in the face and the head, to the point where I was hospitalized with a subarachnoid brain hemorrhage, which is bleeding on the brain, and I nearly died from that. And they repeated violence against me again in 2021. Unfortunately, there are very, very few journalists in the United States who are devoted to this beat of covering Antifa. Because if you do, you're subjected to threats, to violence. People can show up at your house. So it's a very dangerous subject that I cover, but I do it because people don't realize how dangerous this movement is. They can be so destabilizing without actually changing any of the laws. For example, like in Portland, we still have the First Amendment in Portland, Oregon. But if you create an environment where, let's say, Christians who are holding a worship event in public, Republican voters who are holding a rally, or women who are protesting for women's rights because of transgender ideology, and these are all examples that have happened in Portland, these rallies would be subjected to violence from Antifa and police don't respond. So it creates a culture where people then eventually silence themselves, because if you organize in public, if you engage in your First Amendment rights, you could be subjected to mob violence and police will do nothing. Nobody will get arrested because nobody can be identified. I've been a victim of Antifa's violence repeatedly over the years, and unfortunately, nobody's been arrested, much less prosecuted and convicted for any of these mob beatings.
A lot of my viewers, a lot of my listeners are hearing a lot of what you're saying probably for the first time, certainly at the detail level that you're talking about. And this may be old hat to you, so bear with me here, because we have a chance to educate a lot of the 70% in the middle. This is who I think it's really important to wake up.
Yes.
And give information about what you're talking about. And you've probably talked about some of this till you're blue in the face, but I need you to get a little bluer because I need you to fill in the blanks. I think what I'm hearing you say is that they'll both spark a riot, they'll go to a larger demonstration and embed themselves in a big group or a big movement, and then get it to devolve into something that is a lot more destructive than it would have been otherwise. My question to you, when I say, who are these people? You say they're mostly young people. When they get up the next day, they go do this, they go throw bricks through windows, they start fires, they burn cars, they turn them over, they attack people, and they might do it with 30 people or 130 people, depending on their investment in that cause. When they get up the next morning, where do they go? What are their jobs? Who are these people? How are they absorbed back into society when they're not wearing their black disguises? Where do we find these people? Where are they during the day, during the week, when they're not out creating havoc?
Great question. So in Portland at the time, I did public records requests of the people who were arrested night after night. Some nights there were 30 people being arrested a night, and I would request all the names, the mugshots, and the charges. And then I would systematically try to look through age, educational background, race, anything I could find. Well, what's their social media posting? Unsurprisingly, a lot of their social media accounts had Antifa propaganda on it in terms of identifying themselves with the movement through the use of some of these symbols. Your listeners can think of Antifa as a gang, as an informal gang that one can self-identify with. And the danger of that is it's similar in a way to ISIS or some of these jihadist groups that have carried out terrorist attacks. You don't have to have been somebody, for example, who have traveled to Syria or Iraq to become a formal ISIS member. You can follow the propaganda that's online, watch the videos, read the materials, and pledge allegiance to the ideology and carry it out and attack, either as an individual or connected to a local cell, for example. Antifa's ideology is similar in that type of way. So who are they? Well, they actually span the full spectrum of society, there's a misconception that because if you look at some of the mugshots, some of them look dirty, and some people assume, oh, they're just crazy homeless people who have been drawn into violence. Well, there are people who are represented in white collar professions, academics, university students, PhD students, people who work in healthcare. Unfortunately, there were a lot of nurses and those who worked in medical settings who were arrested in 2020. And then you had some people, yes. And then you had also those who were chronically unemployed, living on public assistance. And during 2020, rioting became a full-time hobby or profession for a lot of these people who were on public assistance, getting funds through the state, and at night going out to riot. And then there were also homeless people. The role of the homeless people was that they were exploited at many of these encampments, and that became riots at night. Free food was being given out, so it attracted people who were homeless. Tents and shelter were provided, but it was used as a form of bribery against people who really had nothing to lose. So some of the homeless people would be given weapons. Weapons were dispersed by Antifa, such as projectile weapons, frozen water bottles, even cans of food. Lasers were given out, these green, powerful lasers that would be concentrated on the eyes of law enforcement to damage their eyes. And there were dozens of federal law enforcement officers who had their visions injured in 2020. So it's a slice of all aspects of society. And this is a scary part because people underestimate the potency of these radical extremist beliefs that are out there. I know, Dr. Phil, you've written a lot about your love for America. I love America. My parents came to the United States as refugees and victims of communism from Vietnam. And I know many of your listeners love this country and are good, hardworking people, many who have families. And it might be a bit shocking to believe that in some dark corners of America, unfortunately not really dark corners anymore, it's a bit in the mainstream, at universities, in many cities, there is a mainstreaming of a hatred of America through various ideologies. Some of them, for different reasons, would like to see America destroyed. And so they organize into different movements. I focus on one particular aspect, but all of them have an agenda of revolution. And I know revolution sounds perhaps maybe impossible in America. You know, when we think of revolution, we think of things like from the last century in Europe with the First World War and the interwar years and after the Second World War, when monarchies are being toppled. But I think America is a strong country, but it's not, it does have some weaknesses. And I think we can see it in the way that these attacks on the ideals of what it means to be American, the attack on the symbols of our country. Look at how often it is you see American flags being burnt and how people in public life express a really virulent hatred of their own country, often out of a misunderstanding of reality and facts. But institutions have also been captured. Education, higher education, a lot of media, unfortunately, a lot of journalism have been taken in by various anti-American worldviews. And you see it reflected in the reporting. People can rewrite academics, so-called professionals, rewrite American history now. 1619 Project, for example, which was lauded and received awards. And so America is facing a lot of attacks ideologically, literally as well, through the form of violence. And I guess what I hope that your listeners and viewers grasp is that things are not well in the U.S. And, you know, if you live in a state that didn't experience all the riots, you're living in a suburban area, it may seem kind of like that stuff didn't really happen. But unfortunately, in city to city in the US, there is a lot of political violence. 2020 was an exceptional example, but the people who are involved in that did not face prosecutions by and large, were not imprisoned, were able to learn from their lessons of how to riot effectively, how to fundraise, how to use propaganda effectively. They were able to use that again and are doing it now, currently, with the university encampments that we've seen break out at dozens of universities, not just in America. It's spread to Canada, it's spread to Western Europe. And these encampments have a lot of extremism in it. It's not about human rights for Palestinians in Gaza. It's also calling for a destruction of the state of Israel and a destruction of the United States of America.
That's what I'm hoping that people take away from this conversation, because one of the things that struck me when I was on the UCLA campus when they took down the encampment there, I was there during the day and then again at night when they were taking down that encampment there. And there was a real contradiction. That's a big campus, of course, and you could walk on one part of the campus and there would be a girls' intramural volleyball team walking down the sidewalk, and they're eating an ice cream cone and bouncing their ball and laughing and talking. And you could walk down that part of the campus and it's like everything's just fine. Everything's perfect. It looks like mainstream America. Everything's great and happy and all that. And then you turn a corner and go into the center of campus and, there's the encampment. There's confrontations going on there with pro-Palestinian demonstrators, and there's anti-Semitic signs and posters up and people blocking Jewish students from getting down a sidewalk, and hatred and vitriol and all of this going on. And it's like, what did I just step into the twilight zone here? Even on the same campus. And the same thing can be true, of course, in a city. And I want people to understand that this can be going on in a neighborhood in your city and the next neighborhood not. But there are people that you write about and talk about that would love nothing better than to tear down the structure of America, the family structure in America, the values of America. And for some reason, we've allowed the university system to be hijacked by these left, liberal, anti-American professors at a ratio that is way disproportionate. There aren't centrists there. There's not a balance between left and right there. And you can go in an art history class and hear them in there talking about political agendas and equality of outcome and inequality of income and DEI. I'm like, wait a minute, this is an art history class. What are you in? They have a captive audience and they're pushing this agenda. You look at the average age of the demonstrators that were arrested at Columbia, and I think it was like 27. Those aren't college students. These are outside agitators that came in and pushed this. When we talked about following the money, I looked at UCLA. There was probably, 400 yards of 3/4-inch 4x8 sheets of plywood around there at probably $50 to $75 a sheet. College students don't have that kind of money. They're lucky to get a taco from Jack in the Box. And here they've come up with $20,000 to buy plywood to put around an encampment. Where are they getting that money? That's coming from the outside, right?
Yes, I'm glad you brought up the money, and some of the footage that you showed from your camera crews recording at UCLA. You'll see that the encampment had their own volunteer security guards. So they actually built a hard border. And these are also people who argue for open borders, by the way. So there's a lot of irony and contradictions in their ideology.
Yeah, isn't there, though?
And so it takes significant resources to buy the stuff that you just mentioned. And this is stuff you just noticed on the surface. Tents, obviously, food, water, all their shields and plywood that they use to build. It takes cash right away for that. And in 2020 as well, with the riots, there were people that were distributing weapons and giving out food and tents as well. So when I looked into it at that time, I learned that in 2020, people raised significant sums of money through crowdfunding. A lot of these campaigns would be set up on GoFundMe, for example, or people would establish ad hoc accounts on Cash App and Venmo, and these are apps where one can send money anonymously. And so through these campaigns, and then it was shared with links on Twitter that went viral, some of their campaigns were a bit more official, like connected to a nonprofit. There was a bail fund, for example, that was established in Minnesota to help the riot suspects, the violent suspects in Minneapolis. And Kamala Harris, at that time in 2020, promoted that link, brought in a lot of money. So there's a lot of money through crowdfunding. A lot of the sources of who's donating, we actually don't know because the donors are anonymous. There are also more formal ways of giving, and these are connected more towards big philanthropists. So at these encampments, like at UCLA, at Columbia, and many other places, you have a small radical extremist group of students who are connected to student groups on campus, like Students for Justice in Palestine. Now, these are formal registered groups with chapters across the US. Some of these organizations and their chapters, Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a left-wing activist group that's anti-Israel, have received money at various points or currently through charities that are funded ultimately by George Soros. And there are other big so-called progressive philanthropists who have poured in hundreds of millions of dollars every year into very radical causes, not just the protest movement, but also into the election campaigns of quite ideologically minded politicians. And in the last 4 years, we've seen how much damage that's done, particularly through district attorneys who are elected in various counties and cities. In 2020, there was a whole class of prosecutors whose campaigns received money ultimately through George Soros, through his philanthropy groups. And they've been elected and have done, in my view, significant damage because they have a worldview that is anti-American. They view the criminal justice system as illegitimate because it's systematically racist. So they view that in their role as a prosecutor, and they have the authority to charge people or not. They choose not to charge people to try to level out the disparities in, for example, demographic representations among suspects and convicts. And it's helped add to this huge crime wave that we've seen across the US since 2020. And this is reflected in the FBI data. In my city of Portland, where I know the most, for example, in 2021, 2022, we had back-to-back all-time record homicides, and non-fatal shootings went up 300%. This is also reflected in other cities that have become dangerous, like New York, Seattle, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this huge machine working to undo America. Antifa is one part. That's like the street thugs, you can think of it, that carry out violence on the streets against people, against police. You have big money, you have organized nonprofits, you have student groups, all of it working towards the goal of revolution. And unfortunately, I would say the average person, the 70% you talk about, the normal family working person in America are not aware of this. If you tune into your broadcast television channels, you're not going to be hearing about the threat that's coming from far left violent extremism. if you read the newspapers, Washington Post, New York Times, etc., you're not going to see that as well. And so people are misinformed, and then in front of our eyes, right in front of us, I guess without our eyes on it, this type of violence and organizing is happening.
My problem is it's spreading, and we're not doing anything, certainly educationally, to teach critical thinking where these kids can say, okay, wait a minute, let me unpack what you're telling me here. Let me unpack what I'm seeing on legacy media and see if this even makes sense, if this is in my best interest, if this is in my family's best interest, if this is in our community's best interest. We're not teaching them to say, let me break this down and challenge each one of these assertions and see if they, A, make common sense. Do they get me what I want, what I need, what's going to proliferate our goals in our society? No, we don't seem to be teaching those skills. I mean, maybe they're still teaching them in law school. Maybe. I don't know. I don't go to law school, but it seems like we're focused on teaching young people what to think instead of teaching young people how to think.
Just looking at the encampments that have happened recently, if you look at some of the independent journalists or even mainstream journalists who have gone into the periphery of these encampments because they are usually not allowed in or threatened if they try to go in, they'll ask those students, why are you here? And you'll get some type of generic answer like, for Gaza, for Palestine, to free Gaza. And you ask them more about questions about, some of these chants that you're saying from the river to the sea, do you know what river? Do you know what sea? Do you know the history of how the founding of Israel, of the modern state of Israel happening? They don't know. Do you know some of the militant groups that are involved in these Palestinian territories? No, they don't know. Or they think of Hamas as a liberal type of group. There's so much indoctrination happening at universities. I can speak as somebody, I went to UCLA, I went to Portland State. These are both places that have had encampments. And in addition to the regular education that you have through the courses you take as part of the discipline, the administrators at basically every university, and unfortunately at many high schools now and at many elementary schools as well, they have these what are called diversity, equity, inclusion offices that have that built into also the curriculum of whatever discipline you're in. So you can think of things that wouldn't necessarily intersect with diversity ideology. You're still being taught it. I was taught it when I was a student journalist at Portland State, for example. We had to think about, in your reporting, how is it going to impact vulnerable communities or people of color or religious minorities? You have to think about these power dynamics. And so a lot of this indoctrination is sometimes subtle and often quite in your face. Students don't even realize it. You go through it for years and you just believe it to be fact. You know, the claim that America is systematically racist, our criminal justice system is racist, that policing is racist. All of this is just taken in through a process of indoctrination. And if you look into any of these radical movements, you look at when they have events where there are speakers and people gather together, nobody asks questions. That's one thing you'll notice. Nobody asks questions. They hear various claims. This is racist. That is racist. America is racist. We need revolution. Israel should be, Israel is a white supremacist colonial state. Nobody asks questions. It's just, they listen and they take it on and then they repeat it. And I mean, there are many intellectuals who have described the process of how the march through the institutions have happened by leftist ideologues, the taking over. A lot of it was done through a very slow process. People didn't even realize it was happening. And then now when you look at, for example, the political partisan makeup at universities, you're looking at 99% of people identifying as left or far left in the faculty, for example. The administration is the same. There's a lot of money pumped into the DEI departments. And, you know, we're seeing some places like Florida, under Republican conservative leadership, try to defund this at some of the public institutions. But in other places, particularly like on the West Coast or in the Northeast of America, they've recommitted and doubled down their commitment to it. And I don't, this is actually not about a left or right issue, even though political parties do take on the cause or oppose the cause. The danger of normalizing America hatred is that it's to the detriment to all of us.
So let's play devil's advocate for a minute and say, okay, let's say all of these factions succeed. They're successful in tearing down democracy. Let's say they're successful in getting the institutions that we now have in America that have gotten us to this point. They're successful and it all comes unraveled and comes tumbling down. What do they envision replacing all of this with?
They believe that from the ashes of a dead or dying America that they can siege power. So with the Antifa ideology, for example, they are made up of anarchists and communists. So they don't believe in, for example, free markets or private ownership of property. So the times that they have taken over public property or even private property, such as at these university encampments or in 2020 in Seattle, for 3 weeks, they created what they call the autonomous zone. Like at the university encampments, they created a hard border. They had their border guards there with guns. They checked people who were going in and out. They sieged a major area in the middle of Seattle. The area is called Capitol Hill. And they thought that they could run their own society. They actually had signs that said on it, "You are now leaving the USA. Welcome to Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone." And so what happens in the absence of power, and you can look at this with the autonomous zone as an example of a microcosm, or you can look at failed and failing states right now in the world. In the absence of power, those who siege power are the ones who are the most violent and most brutal. So at the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, it was a police no-go zone. So who came there were gang members. There were shootings almost every night. People got shot and murdered there. A black child was shot and killed. And there was this self-styled warlord who came with his own entourage with rifles and guns. And those who didn't agree with his leadership style shut up because they were afraid. He was at least threatening to use potentially deadly violence against anybody that opposed him. You can look at states like Haiti. In the absence of the state being able to control it, you see gangs now that have destroyed Haiti over and over, failed states. It's like even in Syria and Iraq, ISIS happened because of the failure of the state leadership in Iraq and Syria in big parts of territory. So a lot of the fantasy for these revolutionary people is to believe if America's dead, we can create a utopia where people don't have to own property because everything's communally owned. We'll take care of one another. There's no racism because there's no police. So people will police one another and we won't be shooting dead Black Americans. And a lot of it is just fantasy. They don't understand what happens when people's rights are destroyed and trampled on. And in the absence of the rule of law, what happens? They don't think about that. They read these radical texts, which are distributed, by the way, at these university encampments, at these riots, booklets, printouts that talk about, it's like a religious text. It talks about how wonderful a new world is possible. We just have to get rid of this current one because the current one is so wicked. And no matter how many times they try, Chaz is the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle in 2020 with multiple people shot and killed, this entire neighborhood destroyed and sieged for nearly a month. And the people who were involved in there left and were involved in the University of Washington encampment as well, just recently, 4 years later. So they also don't learn from their mistakes.
That's the thing. Wouldn't you think that the people that get lured into that, I understand the people that are fostering it, but wouldn't you think the people that get lured into it say, okay, so we're in an autonomous zone. What have we got? We've got buckets for bathrooms. We've got control of this zone, and it doesn't look like a place that anybody would want to spend the rest of their life. So you would think, okay, this and yeah, right, but we're going to expand our borders here, and we're going to take over some more blocks. But it seems like anybody with function above the brainstem would look around and say, guys, we're living on the sidewalks here. We can go get virtually any kind of a job. Four of us could go get minimum wage jobs and share a 2-bedroom apartment and be way above this standard of living. And we don't have to worry about a gang coming through here and shooting us in the back of the head. It would seem like any critical thinking at all would say, we can trade up from here.
This is the power of ideology, in particular political ideologies that adopt religious-like aspects to their claims. The people that you're describing, the people that I saw when I was on the ground in Chaz, for example, in 2020, they don't see what you and I see when we look at the reality of the excrement on the streets, the vandalism, the broken windows, the burnt out buildings and fires and ashes on the ground. They view that all as, we have no responsibility now, and yet we have food, we have a place to sleep, the tents, and life is nice. We don't have to work, we're taken care of. That was really kind of how they viewed it, as like, this is a wonderful little experiment, and if only more people could be awoken to this, how this utopia is possible. That's their thinking, and it's not rational, but their ideology happens through a process of radicalizing and brainwashing people. They're blinded by their hatred of their fellow American brethren, hatred of the society around them, that they embrace anything that is destructive.
People asked me at the time, they said, what do you think is going to happen here? And I said, one of two things are going to break this apart. If nobody does anything to go in and break it apart, one of two things is going to break it apart. It's going to be inclement weather or boredom. Because I understand the ideology and all the rah-rah, but after a while, it gets really boring to sit out on the street. I mean, when you think about it, it gets really boring. I've talked to so many homeless people that don't want to be homeless. I mean, they really want to move and change. And they say the worst enemy is boredom. It's like, oh my God, this day is a week long. And it's like every hour is 24 hours long. It's like they'll sit there and look down, it's been 15 minutes. And I thought, surely these people are going to get bored to death. I think a lot of them did. It's like, yeah, I heard all that. And at night, it's kind of fun. You run around, you got torches and all that, but it's hard to sell. But of course, Jim Jones did it down in Jonestown. But then look how that turned out. At some point, somebody's got to look around and go, guys, this just doesn't make sense.
The danger in waiting it out and watching these, hoping that these encampments or the riots just die out, is that they often don't. There is a ideological fervor that continues to drive them, even if they do get bored. For example, and in the course of their boredom, by the way, they do immense destruction to property. Millions of dollars.
You can't wait. It'd be nice if you could just wait them out, starve them out, but by the time you do that, they tear up the library, they tear up City Hall, they tear up the street, they tear up everything. You can't wait on them. Yeah,
but unfortunately, we have a lot of leadership at these universities who have waited it out and or also have negotiated with them and given the occupiers everything they wanted. For example, at University of Washington, that had one of the longest encampments at 3 weeks. It was very violent. The university president there announced that the occupiers have agreed to voluntarily remove themselves. The university will not pursue any conduct violations for anybody who's a student, and will also not pursue justice through the criminal justice system. So they've been able to enact all this violence for 3 weeks and vandalism and threats in Seattle, and they got away with it. Very similarly in Portland as well, with the besieging of the library, the largest library and one of the largest research universities in the state of Oregon. For 4.5 days, the president allowed it, and they destroyed that library. That library is out of commission now all the way until the fall term, and the estimates that it can be up to $1 million in damages. And I just ask, I would ask these people, like, for what? But I already know the answer. The violence and the destruction is the what. Yeah.
And what's the answer?
There's not a simple answer. The immediate things that can be done is to vote out district attorneys who are not willing to uphold the law. Unfortunately, in many, many counties that have large cities in the United States, Philadelphia, Austin, Texas, Portland, Oregon, I can go on and on. You have openly, politically, ideologically motivated prosecutors who don't want to prosecute crime, particularly if there is a left-wing ideological component to that type of criminality. They would just choose not to prosecute those crimes, and it emboldens criminals to commit more crimes. And that's what happened in Portland. There were 120 nights of riots in 2020. 4 months of riots every single night. And sometimes these people were arrested, released, and within less than 24 hours was literally re-arrested again at another riot. So a revolving door. I'm speaking to you in Portland right now, is where in Multnomah County they have elections going on, and the district attorney, Mike Schmidt, who was and is the prosecutor who oversaw the riots in 2020, he's asking for voters to give him an opportunity to be in office for another 4 years. So one answer is to get these prosecutors out. Two is then to also look at city council. City council really can empower political violence and extremism, defunding the police, spreading the propaganda of the rioters. What's happening at the university and campuses is outside of the reach of most of the politicians for the most part, because this is involving lack of leadership from universities. But you and I, as taxpayers, the destruction that happens at these public universities, we ultimately have to foot the bill. The Portland State President has said that. That's the case with the library that was destroyed.
Well, of course, because those are public buildings.
Exactly.
And when they do this at schools, do you know if the schools are suspending these students that are in these encampments illegally against policy when they've been told that they're trespassing and they have to leave? When they finally cleared, do they suspend them? Did Washington?
No. And in fact, most places where there were encampments, the administrators chose as part of the negotiations to specifically not give any consequences to any university-affiliated occupiers. Very, very few have been suspended.
I have this from the acting president of Harvard when they cleared out there. It read, earlier this morning, the protesters agreed to end the encampment in Harvard Yard. Now that the area is being cleared and in line with the conversation I had with students last week, I will facilitate a meeting with the chair of the Corporation Committee on Shareholder Responsibility and other university officials to address questions about the endowment, which means they're going to discuss divestment. And it says, in keeping with my commitment to ongoing reasoned dialogue, The Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and I will meet with students to hear their perspective on academic matters related to long-standing conflicts in the Middle East. And then it says, at Harvard, our schools have responsibility for our involuntary leave and disciplinary processes. With the disruption to the educational environment caused by the encampment now abated, I will ask that the schools promptly initiate applicable reinstatement proceedings for all individuals who have been placed on involuntary leaves of absence. I will also ask disciplinary boards within each school to evaluate expeditiously, according to their existing practices and precedents, the cases of those who participated in the encampment. They're gonna lift the suspensions and put these kids back in school.
They are. They're also giving the occupiers what they want, which is divesting from Israel.
They sold out.
There's a reason why people say don't negotiate with terrorists, because when you show that you're willing to give into those tactics, it's going to be used again. That's what happened with the riots before. It's going to happen again with the student extremism on campus. And it's, as you mentioned earlier, it's not just students who are involved. You have a small group of really radical students who work hand in hand with outside professional agitators. And they should be expelled. But very few were suspended. The few who were are going to be having the suspensions removed. And so we'll have more political violence and extremism on campuses. It's going to spill out into the public. The network's already there, the organizations, the nonprofits, the funding streams, the tactics that they use.
Well, it is frustrating to me, as I know it is to you, but you and I just have to keep absolutely beating the drum. I really worry about you. You've been practically beat to death twice. I know you're taking care and caution now, but you're no good to us if you're not here. So you got to take care of yourself and get security around you and take care and be careful. And I know you don't let people know where you are most of the time, true?
That's true. I've had to relocate outside of the U.S. because of the death threats against me, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to ask you where you are. I'll let you keep that to yourself and stay on the move. We're going to have to stop, but I could talk to you for 2 more hours. But listen, Andy's book is Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. And as he has today, I think in very understandable ways, he pulls the curtain back in this book and provides insight as to who these people are and what their agenda is. This is something that we can't turn a blind eye to just because it may not be impacting your life directly in the moment. In here, he talks about the financing, the organization, the way they use propaganda to manipulate us through the media, what their ideology is, and something he calls lawfare, where they really harass through frivolous lawsuits. This isn't something where different groups around the country just come up with ideas. This is organized. There's a plan. This is chess, not checkers. They've got a plan for taking down this country from the inside out because they think they've got a better plan. The problem is their plan has been tried, and we got lots of corpses around this world to prove it doesn't work. But by the time people figure that out, it'll be too late. So we're trying to sound the warning bells about this stuff, him in his way, me in mine. But Andy, I hope we can keep this dialogue going and help each other keep our message getting out there. So I hope we can talk some more in the future. Again, the book is Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. I've read it. You need to read it. I highly recommend it. It's also very entertaining. It's a page turner. You'll read this in very short order, and you'll be a lot better informed for it. Andy, I appreciate you taking time to talk to us today.
Dr. Phil, thank you so much, and thank you for informing your listeners and viewers about how important this subject is. I'm so thankful for that.
We'll stay in touch, and if you need anything we can help you get the word out on, let me know. Otherwise, we'll just stay in touch. Fair enough?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Phil.
All right. Stay safe, man.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.